And the title is Things Don't Just Happen. God's always got a plan. Things don't just happen. God's always got a plan. And I'm absolutely convinced that God can use each and every one of us this morning, regardless of the situation we presently find ourselves in and the situations we find ourselves facing. And He uses us in spite of the situations that we might bring glory or fame to who He is, so other people can witness our endeavors and be encouraged that there is a God. There is a God that loves them. There's a God that can do for them as He does for us. For some of us, today's a pretty cool day. We're not really going through anything. Our life is very fitting. It's coming together rather nicely, and we really wouldn't change much. But for others, you would most definitely make a few changes about your life if you could. The apple cart's been upset, as they say. Life hasn't been easy. You're facing some situations that you wish were different. Each of us has a choice concerning what we're going to do in our present situation. We can make the most of it by allowing God to use us in the here and now. And that's a challenge. Are you at a place in your relationship that you've determined that you're going to let God use you in the here and now? And when I say the here and now, I'm looking at some of you and you're like 14, 15 years old. I'm looking at others and you're like 50, 60 years old, 70 years old, 80 years old. I'm looking at others and I see Donna. But God's able to use you in the present condition, in the way that you are right now, if we'll allow Him to. Or we can kind of spend our days wishing for different circumstances than the ones that we are presently experiencing. Now, there's a girl in the Bible, a young woman, and I've preached on this a lot of times. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Esther. And this morning we're going to look at Esther's life and not really go through the story, but we're going to, because you know the story, but we're going to pull some things out of the story that will encourage you to know that God's got your back, that He's got something planned for you in spite of your circumstances. I believe that Esther has something to tell us about how God needs us to fulfill His plan for our lives where we presently are. Now, there may come a time where God will lead us to a different place than where we're at right now. But this morning, we want to take a look at Esther's life and kind of the overarching of it. And I want to share with you 3 facts about her life. And then we're going to look at how she is able to bring us some encouragement today based on these facts. Number 1, Esther was placed in a different family. What I mean by that, Esther was a young girl and both of her parents had died, and she was adopted by her cousin. And the Bible says he, meaning Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. For she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure, and she was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now, fortunately for Esther, Mordecai was a godly man, and he loved his father in heaven, and he also loved Esther. And he was bound and determined to raise her in a proper way. But the fact that stands out here is that Esther began life with the disadvantage of not knowing her father and not having her parents involved in her life. So she was placed in a different family. Number 2, Esther was placed in a different culture. See, Esther was a Jewish girl who had been removed from the customs of her people. She's now living in a culture, for the most part, she does not know anything about it, and this culture does not acknowledge God that she acknowledges, meaning the God of Israel. The food is different, the customs are different, the laws are different. In fact, Esther's displacement, depending how old she was at the time of her parents' deaths, was most assuredly a culture shock. To go from the land of the Jews to the land of the Persians was a radical shift. It wasn't like you and I going from Ohio to Pennsylvania. It might be like us going from Ohio to Michigan. No, it'd be like us going from Ohio to Afghanistan. You know, that would be a cultural shock. It was radical. Number 3, Esther was placed in a different position. The king of Persia was looking for a new wife. You might say, what happened to his old one? I ate nothing. He had plenty of them. Part of the cultural thing of the Persians at that time. So he sent out men to collect the most beautiful virgins in his kingdom so that he could place them in his harem. Esther was one of the virgins chosen. And the king chose Esther above the rest of them to be his queen. They had sort of like a beauty contest, and she won. So Esther did not choose her family. She did not choose her culture. And she did not choose her position. Neither have you chosen the circumstances that you're involved with right now in your life. But Esther, she was where she was. And the circumstances of her life were the circumstances of her life. Whether she liked them or not, that's how it was. For most of us, we have a lot more choices than Esther. But one thing that we have very much in common with her, and that should stand out to each and every one of us, and that is that God will use our present situation to bring glory to himself if we allow him to use us as we are, what we have, and who we can be to his glory. And you have to make up your mind to do that, regardless of where you find yourself right now. Are you prepared to say, I'm going to let God use me, who I am, where I am, and what I'm involved with right now? Beginning today, we're going to learn how to accept God's placement in our lives. That's hard to do sometimes. It's hard to do at a death or the loss of a job or a circumstance that you might be involved with it. And it may or may not be because of your positioning in it, or your decisions in it. Whether it is or not, it's still circumstances that you find yourself involved with. So we want to get a little deeper into Esther's story. But I want to give you a list of a few main players in it. We have the king of Persia, who made Esther his wife. And then we have the cousin of Mordecai, who was made queen of Persia. And then we have Esther's cousin, who revealed a plot to kill the king, saving the king's life. And then we have the prime minister of Persia. He's an all-around, no-good-for-nothing villain. He's the Lex Luthor of his day. He's a villain who wanted to kill all the Jews. He wanted to extinguish them. He wanted to get rid of them. He wanted to have his own personal Holocaust. And all because he hated one man, which was Esther's cousin, Mordecai. Think of a guy that's got such an evil black heart that would want to destroy a whole nation because of one man. It's almost like the devil himself. But these are the four folks that kind of play in this story. So, accepting God's placement requires a few things. We're going to look at those. And it really does. It plays out. And you're going to recognize these in your life. Some of these you have acted on, and some of them you've kind of shied back from. But if we're going to accept God's placement in our lives, it's going to require some things. Number one, it's going to require some courage. Courage is something that you're not going to get from another man. Courage is something that instills within you from God himself. It's not like the cowardly lion in the Wizard of Oz who wants some courage, but trying to get it from someone else. But this courage comes from God. Soon after Esther was made queen, she was put in quite a predicament. Haman, the prime minister, convinced the king that he should wipe out the entire Jewish race, get them out of his kingdom. Up until this point, Esther, she has not revealed that she also was a Jew. But Mordecai knew she was a Jew, and Mordecai knew he was a Jew, and he got word to her that only she would have any chance to change the mind of the king. So Esther, after receiving this message from her cousin, she sent him a message back. And she said, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. And that law says that we're to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been called. I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Now, in the ancient Persian culture, you had to be summoned by the king. Even if you were his wife, if you went into his presence, you could be put to death. So Esther, she had a valid concern. She's already dealing with a lot of stuff. So Mordecai, when he got this note from his cousin, he sent her another note. And this note said this: then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. I find that fascinating. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I like those words. Those are encouraging words. Those are words that make my chest stick out a little farther, that makes my heart beat a little stronger. God has chosen you, and God has chosen me for such a time as this. And we can take encouragement from Esther's predicament. This is a fascinating statement that Mordecai makes. He is saying here to Esther, you need to have courage to do whatever it takes to make this thing happen. But if you don't, God will find someone else who will. My, what a faith that Mordecai must have had in God and the love he had for his cousin. If you don't do this, God's going to find someone else who will. And furthermore, who knows but that God placed you here for this specific reason. Now, I think that you and I can learn a lot from that statement about our situations that we find ourselves in. God wants us to have the courage to act when he calls on us to act. But if we don't, he's going to find someone who he can use to fulfill his plan. I've never wanted to miss the opportunity to be used of God. And I hope that you never want to miss the opportunity to be used of God. If you don't allow God to use you, then he will find someone else to use. And you will have missed out on perhaps one of the greatest adventures that God would like to have taken you on. You will die unfulfilled. You will die cold and indifferent because you missed that opportunity to go with God. So we have to have courage. And there's always going to be the naysayers when you step out with courage. Are you stupid? You're willing to open up that hornet's nest? You got hit in the head with a rock? What's wrong with you? It takes courage to be obedient to God. If you're going to accept God's placement, it's also going to require some initiative. And to take the initiative just simply means to take that first step that's necessary. Esther was willing to do whatever it took to save her people. And this is what she said. Her final note back to Mordecai. Then I will go to the king. Though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. But I'm going to go to the king. Have you ever taken that stand with your life? Have you ever realized that God is with you and you're with God, and even though you open up the hornet's nest and they sting you to death, if you perish, but you're going to be obedient to God. It reminds me of the Hebrew children. O king, play the music. O king, heat up the furnace. Do what you want to. God's going to deliver us one way or the other, but we will not bow down. And the church today has been called not to bow down to a secular, humanistic, progressive agenda that's ruled by the liberal elite. And whether you know it or not, it's coming to a home real close to you. And will you have the courage of Esther and the Hebrew children to simply say, if I perish, I perish. But my voice will be heard. I'll not cower back, and I'm willing to take the first step. I'm willing to have an initiative. There's always that first step to be taken in accepting God's plan for our lives. Perhaps God is calling some of you right now, today, to make a greater stand for Him in our homes, in our places of worship, in our employment, in our schools. I tell you right now to our young folks, we better be training them. We better be encouraging them. They're going out to the public arena that's called our schools, and it's almost like going into the lion's den anymore. Are your children prepared to be able to say, as a teenager, if I perish, I perish? I will not bow down. I've got a gospel to declare that's burning in my heart, and I will speak it. I will raise my voice. I will lift it like a trumpet. There will be no hesitation. People won't be trying to figure out what they're hearing. They're going to hear the sound of a trumpet. It's not going to sound like an oboe. It's not going to sound like a piccolo. I'm going to lift up my voice with the noise of a trumpet. Maybe God's calling us to take that initiative of boldly telling others about the love of Christ. Is it possible that God is trying to get into our heads at this very moment and give us that impetus, that drive, that forward momentum that we might realize that He can use you, and He wants to use you, but you must be willing to step out in faith. If you hesitate or you cower back, God cannot use you. The two requirements that we've covered so far, you have to have courage and you have to have an initiative. The third thing that Esther teaches us is awareness. And when I speak of awareness, I'm specifically referring to the awareness of God's presence in every situation that we find ourselves in. How do you know that God has not placed you in the current situation that you find yourself in right now? How do you know that He does not have specifically a role for you to fulfill in your life so that His fame and His glory and who He is can be publicized by how you handle the role? You've taken the courage, you've taken the initiative, and you're aware that God's in the arrangements of this. Maybe you're not in ideal circumstances right now. But could it be that if you begin to look at your life as a servant in God's hand, you might begin to look at your situation somewhat differently? Could it be that God has placed you where you are because He expects you to be a missionary to the people that are in your midst? That you would you wouldn't have them around you. You wouldn't have the opportunity if it wasn't for the predicament that you find yourself in. Mordecai reminded his dear cousin of the need for awareness. He said, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? I was going home last evening, and this has been one of those weeks where I guess I've needed it, but God has shared with me over and over again, much as the song that Donna sang this morning, and much as some of the songs we sang in the praise group this morning, that God loves me, and He's with me. My inadequacies, I don't have to look at those. My lack, I don't have to look at that, because God's got the adequacies and God has got the supplements. And He's let me know in a very real, personal, intimate way that I'm His and He is mine, and He's calling the shots right now in my life. And I have to be obedient to those things. And you have to be obedient to those things also. Take the courage, take the initiative, and be aware. The fourth thing that Esther encourages with is prayer. Oh, I love those moments of prayer. You and I will never understand our role in this world until we begin to communicate with God through prayer. A lot of folks say that Esther is not a theological book. Those that are learned scholars, well, I take exception to that. I disagree with it. It may not be a doctrinal treatise, and it doesn't try to explain how God works in the universe. But it is a living example of God's power working through an individual. And we are individuals. So we can take great encouragement out of the book of Esther. Esther understood the need for God in her circumstances. So she called on the people to intercede on her behalf. This is just lovely. Before approaching the king, Esther sent another message to Mordecai. And this is what she said. She said, now, cousin, I'm ad-libbing there, but she says, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa or in Persia, and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. How would you respond to a brother and sister in Christ who was going through such an ordeal, and they called you up and they said, Doug, don't want you to eat anything for 3 days. Don't want you to drink anything for 3 days. I want you to join me in prayer. What I'm getting ready to do is really weighing on me. If you don't mind, would you call so-and-so and ask them if they do the same thing? How would we respond to such a request? I don't know. But I find that fascinating. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Persia, hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Esther understood that accepting God's placement and moving into God's plan requires a prayerful communication with the God who is leading. We don't just take it for granted. We got skin in the game, as they say. We've got something to offer. God's got something to offer, but we've got to put something into it. So we have courage, we have initiative, we have awareness, we have prayer. There's also some planning. The day finally came when Esther, approached the king and unannounced, I'm sorry. She approached the king and she was unannounced. He immediately held out the scepter. I like that wording there. It wasn't like a hesitation. It wasn't like, well, here she comes. You know, what's she doing here? It said he immediately. Now, do you think the prayer and the fasting by Esther, her young maidens, and the rest of the Jewish community, you think it had something to do with the king moving quickly? Oh, I do. I do. He moved quickly. And that was signifying that she was not in any danger and that he wanted her to approach him. So she's beginning to set forth a plan here. And she invited both the king and his evil servant Haman to a banquet where she would make an important request to the king. And Haman, he went home from this invitation that he received overjoyed, bragging to his friends, bragging to his wife. Oh, the queen of Persia is having a banquet, and she's inviting nobody but the king and me. Oh, he just was so full of himself. But on his way out the door, he ran into Mordecai, who refused to bow down to him. And Haman told this to his wife. After getting this wonderful news, he runs into Haman, and then he tells this to his wife. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. What an evil, bitter man Haman was. So Haman's wife and friends, they convinced him to build a gallows to hang him on. Now, you only have to build a gallows probably 8 foot high would do it. Most people aren't taller than 8 foot. So you just have to be 8 foot. You can hang the guy, he's going to kick around and die. But they built a gallows 75 foot high. 75 foot high, they built this gallows with a noose hanging there. It's just amazing to me, the hate that was in their hearts for Mordecai. But there's one thing that Haman didn't know about. He didn't know that Mordecai, quite a while back, had once saved the king's life. And the very night before the banquet that Esther was going to have for the king and invited Haman to come, that very night before the banquet, the king couldn't sleep. He slept fine before, but that night he could not sleep. So he decided to have a servant come in and read through the historical records of his kingdom. While reading, he was reminded of Mordecai's willingness to save his life, and was informed by his servants that Mordecai had never received any reward. Now, do you think that the fasting and the prayers had something to do with the king not being able to sleep that night? Do you think the fasting and the prayers had something to do with him asking the servant to come in and read some historical records? Now, they could have landed any place in these historical records, but they happened to land at the place where Mordecai had saved the king's life. The next morning, the king hadn't slept. The next morning, Haman showed up. And the king sought his advice on how he should honor a man who has pleased him greatly. And Haman, he thought the king was talking about him. Oh my, I'm going to write my own ticket. I have a blank check. So Haman, he began to talk to the king. And he told the king, he said, the king should place the king's own robe on such a man, put him on the king's own horse, and lead him through the city with a prince to announce in the streets that this is how the king honors a man that pleases him. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, just as you said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing. Don't leave any stone unturned that you have mentioned. Have you ever placed yourself in that story? And how would you have responded? I mean, he's having a gallows built 75 feet high to hang the guy on. And the king says, I want you to lead him through the streets. I want you to give him my robe, put him on my horse, and I want you to lead him through the streets and tell the people this is what the king does to honor one that greatly pleases him. The hammers was probably still being pounded, putting the gallows together. In addition to all this, the next day was the banquet. Haman arrived at Esther's banquet, and the king asked Esther to make any request. The banquet must have really been over the top. I mean, there must have been wonderful entertainment. The food must have been exquisite. The setting must have just been something that just stole the king's heart, because this is what the king said. The king asked Esther to make any request of him that she desired, and that he would give it to her up to half of the entire kingdom. That must have been some banquet. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And we've been sold merely as slaves, men and women. I would have been silent for our affliction, for it's not to be compared with the loss to the king. And the king demanded to know who would dare to touch Esther, who would dare to touch her people. And she said, a foe, an enemy. And you could just about tell the emotion that was in her voice. It's a foe, it's an enemy, it's the wicked Haman. She's bringing these accusations to one who was second in command of Persia. He was one of the princes. The gallows just being finished up. Mordecai being shamed, or Haman being shamed and leading Mordecai through the streets. And now the banquet turned out to be a death benefit for Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Esther, she pointed out Haman for the wicked man that he was. And the king was enraged. There's really no way to compare the rage that the king had. But he was so enraged that he had Haman hung from the very gallows that had just been finished up for Mordecai. After Haman was hanged, 75 feet in the air, the king turned over Haman's entire estate to Esther. In other words, Haman's wife was now homeless. She was a pauper. His children were banished. It was like the whole world turned upside down for Haman's family, all because he couldn't get over Mordecai not bowing down to him. And this is how it all played out. The king took the signet ring that had been Haman's sign of authority in the kingdom and gave it to Mordecai. So Mordecai now had authority, had an estate. He had it all because Esther gave her cousin the estate of Haman. Now, there's a lot more to this story that I got time to go into today, but I want you to know something about the necessity of planning for God's work in your life. Esther knew that God was calling her to ask the king for freedom of the Jews. She knew that Haman was responsible, and she had planned to tell the king. But look what God did. He used Esther and her plan to see his will done. But God added to her plan. God is the one that arranged all the circumstances of her life. He arranged all the circumstances of Haman's life. He arranged all the circumstances for Mordecai's life. And he arranged all the circumstances for the king's life, so that everything would work together for God's glory. This happened several thousand years ago, but today God is still getting glory out of it. And I'm probably not the only one in the world preaching about Esther and Mordecai and Haman and the king today. It's being broadcast, and it'll continue to be broadcast as long as there is a remnant of the church. And God gets the glory. And it's to encourage us to have courage to move forward in spite of our circumstance that we're involved with, to move forward. God can take your plan and your willingness to act upon His calling and use it to His glory. The circumstances you find yourself in today are not yours alone. God is in this thing with you. And if you will begin to allow Him to work in your present situation, great results will not be very far down the road. Sometimes when we're going through difficult times, we have a tendency to be the Eeyore or woe is me. But you're not alone. You really can get up and bounce like Tigger. You've got someone with you that's going to deliver you. One way or the other, God is going to deliver you. He is with you. And there's going to be great results. What would have been the great results if Esther would have perished? Heaven. What would have been the great results for the Hebrew boys? Heaven. But God spared their lives so that His glory and His fame could be spread abroad. And that's what He wants to do with you. So in conclusion this morning, I hope that all of us gathered here knows that God is looking at us right now. Look at that as a challenge to you as an individual. God is looking at you right now. He knows the exact circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And that He can use those circumstances for His glory. And He can use those circumstances for our gain. I take delight in that. I know I'm not much. But God wants to give me gain. And He wants to get glory out of my life. He doesn't look at your position. He doesn't look at your education. He doesn't look at your status. He looks at you as one He loves. And none of these other things is going to make Him love you more or less. He's just looking for somebody who will love Him back, and that love will shine through in the circumstances you find yourself in and how you respond to those. It doesn't matter if you're the President of the United States, if you're a Saudi Arabian sheikh that's got billions of dollars in oil out under the sand, or if you're waiting on a disability check or a welfare check or an unemployment check. Those things don't matter to God. What matters to God is, in spite of your circumstances, you're willing to be utilized by Him. Looking for the sovereignty of God's movement in your life where you are right now. He wants to let you know that He loves you. And He'd like for you to love Him back, reciprocal. But He wants you to know He loves you. It's not a matter of can God use my circumstances, but will I let Him? That's a big statement. We know God can, but are you in a position to let Him use those circumstances? He has a purpose for your life. He has a greater good. He has a greater purpose than what we tend to see when we're going through the situation. So we need to just say, God, I'm going to let you use these circumstances. I'm looking for your presence. I'm not wishing they were different. I'm looking for you in the midst of these. And I know good things are going to come my way. Great results are going to come out of this. I'm willing to say to God today, yes, you can use me today, however you will. So the challenge is, how about you? Are you willing to allow God to use you? We're going to ask you to stand.